Hello, everybody. Imelda here again. Thank you to all of you who watched my podcast from Lost to Healing. And I'm here today to my aim here today is to try and answer some of the questions, many questions that you asked me, for which I'm very grateful. Just to remind anybody who's seeing this without having seen my former video, that the answers I'm giving to questions today relate to what I talked about in that video. So if you seem a bit lost, that's why. So you might like to have a look at that before you listen to this video.
Yeah. So a lot of questions refer to your experiences in the home and why, for example, you didn't tell your parents.
Okay, well, for that I have to go back to how Irish society was at that time. Now, I want to begin by saying, first of all, that Irish society has changed phenomenally since that happened to me in the 1960s. And of course, it was going on long before. It was going on from the foundation of the state. But we have to look back at where we came from. And where we came from in Ireland was 700 years of colonisation. During that time, we were robbed of our language, of our culture, and we had very little sense of ourselves and our own autonomy. Now, we weren't alone in that, because if you think about African Americans, the Aboriginal peoples in Australia, if you look at all the people who were taken from their country, Africa, and spread around the world, particularly to America, as slaves. So the other thing that happened in Ireland was, and the same with Aboriginal people and Native Americans, the propaganda in Britain, who was our colony, was that we were uncivilized, part animal, and that had very detrimental effect on Irish people, as many Irish people went to work in England. Of course, that's a requirement, and the African Americans were savages. The African slaves, well, they're not quite as intelligent as we are. And somebody actually said to me that they thought that the Aboriginal people in Australia was devolving. Now, I don't know if that's actually possible to go against the natural evolutionary process. But you see, if you're going to colonize a people and ultimately starve them, as they did in Ireland, with what is euphemistically called a famine, for reasons I don't understand, you have to dehumanize them, because you can't tell yourself that you're doing that to a human being. So that's the position we arrived at, and post-famine, even before we got our independence from Britain in the early 1920s, the Catholic Church, the Roman Catholic Church, stepped in. And so they were dealing with a people who, as I said, had no sense of their own autonomy. They didn't have any sense that they could push or question authority. And the church was really saying, you're sinners, and you're suffering because you're sinners. And there was in every country, this is my understanding, there was a non-acceptance, if you like, of having a baby outside of marriage or premarital sex. But that was really emphasized by the Catholic Church. And so that brought about a huge shame, because it was it was kind of the biggest sin to have had. And so the sin of somebody in a home for unmarried mothers, pregnant, about to have their baby, wasn't that they were having a baby, but that baby was proof that they'd had sex. The shame that it brought with it was colossal. And I talked about my experience of finding that shame in my earlier video. So you'd be ashamed to tell your parents, and you'd be ashamed to go home, because it brought that shame on your family. And and that would be commented on. So the result of that was we were imprisoned, we were punished, we were rejected from society and virtually put in prison because you couldn't go out. You couldn't, you had to stay there in confinement for the last 3 months of your pregnancy and for the birth. One question that came up in that, I think, was that somebody asked, oh yeah, did they give us any support in the home, such as talking to us about, birth and what we might expect? Like, can I tell you, the pregnancy was like the elephants in the room. I never remember a nun referring to the fact that I was pregnant, and also us as a group of women didn't discuss how we ended up there. We never discussed our journey to that place. It was like we were all sitting around with big bellies and just completely ignoring it and getting on with the days as best we could. Something popped into my head there to say to you, and it's popped out again, so I'll just keep talking until it comes back. Oh yes, what I wanted to say was that you have to remember as well that I was there because I had a sexual relationship with a young man. But many women were there because they'd been raped or sexually abused, and some of that would have been familial and some of it might have been clerical. So there was the extra shame of all those things as well. So what I say, it was a huge suppression and a punishment of women. Where are all the unmarried fathers? They didn't need to be punished, apparently. And shame on the Catholic Church for representing God as an unloving, uncompassionate, unforgiving God.
And why didn't the yoga work?
Well, you see, the yoga did work because the yoga formed the basis of everything. It introduced me to a new philosophy for living. It introduced me to a new way of connecting with God or spirit or my soul, or however you like to refer to that yourself. If I hadn't engaged in the yoga, if I hadn't practiced and indeed trained as a teacher and studied the philosophy and everything at that time, I wouldn't have had the basis of coming into silence and stillness that is essential to the healing process.
So, what was the pivotal point in your life after the birth of your son?
Well, first of all, I want to say that the birth of my son was a huge pivotal point in my life. I think up until then, I was a bit lacking in direction and focus. I didn't really have any idea about what I wanted from my life or what to do with my life or who I was. And I think the experience of him coming into my life was a very grounding experience. Now he was the focus of my life. And not only was he the focus of my life, I had to take care of him, which was a 24/7 job for any mother, knows that. The other pivotal experience, obviously, was starting yoga. And I've talked about that as well in my earlier video, excuse me, and why I thought that happened to me at that time. However, the main pivotal point in my starting my healing process was sharing my story with the homeopath. That was just liberating. Because just after that one thing, just after that one thing of sharing that story with somebody who listened with compassion and without judgment was so freeing. And suddenly she was part of my life. I found myself when people would say to me, Imelda, do you have children? My answer was always, I have a son. My answer now became, well, I had a daughter who died at birth, and I have my son who's alive and well. And people's response would just be, oh, I'm sorry for your loss. I'm really sad that happened to you. And I realized that you can share, and you don't have to tell everything all in one go. You know, you can just tell what you're able to share at that time. And by doing that, I gradually became more and more courageous and told people about being in a home. And when I did, I met other women who had been in homes and they had never spoken about it. So it was a huge opening for me, that sharing. And so, what I would say to anyone listening, if you have something that you have a difficulty sharing, there will be somebody in your life who will be able to listen. Maybe you'll need professional help, whether a professional listens better than a friend, I don't know. That depends on the professional and on the friend.
Do you believe trauma is a gift?
I think it can be, but it's only a gift if you can find the means to first accept it and to secondly to work with it. If you're unable to work with it, and like me, you know, you may need the help of others around you. But yes, I would say it is, for me, it was a gift because I could never have arrived at the place that I am today, having those experiences and having gone through the process of healing it. I am in a place in my life where I feel incredibly free and content.
Do you think what happened was your karma?
Well, I have to say to that, it could have been. I've had no experience or no evidence presented to me that it was. Now, the idea of karma comes from the ancient teachings of India and perhaps Tibet also. The idea behind karma is that your thoughts result in actions, and that you have all these thoughts going around in your mind, the same thoughts over and over, and maybe you notice yourself doing that, because I have at times. But the idea in yoga is that these become samsaras. In other words, they're like tracks on an old vinyl record, and the needle just keeps playing and replaying. And the idea of the practice of yoga was to break out of that constant playing of that vinyl record with the needle scratching around the grooves. And then our actions are the results of our thinking. So in Patanjali's book on yoga, The Aphorisms of Yoga, number 1, he said, this is instruction in the practice of yoga. And number 2, he said, yoga is the control of the thought waves of the mind. And you see, we are all born into this life, into any life, on our soul journey. And we are presented with the challenges and the lessons and the conditions to be able to change those samsaras, if you like. And that is actually what I did, because I was healing a pain pattern in my brain. So I was taking that needle out of that groove. So another way that I sometimes think about karma is that I think it is an opportunity to respond differently. So if you have responded negatively to somebody or some event in your life, whether it's this life or a past life, karma offers you the opportunity to respond differently, and so to erase that groove. But I think in this life, from my thinking of it that way, what I think is very important is that if I feel I have wronged somebody, that I've spoken to them out of turn or maybe angrily or out of my own pain, that it's important that I go back and say, you know, the last time I spoke to you, this was what happened, and I apologize for my part and take responsibility for my part. And I think if you want to stop creating karma in this life, that is one means that I use of doing it. Good question.
So, did your sewing feel healing and grounding for you?
Now, do you know, when I saw this question first, I was going to dismiss it. I thought, what's sewing got to do with my healing? Now, doing something like sewing and creating something can be grounding. And when I was really bad with the headaches for a long number of years, I mean, I did do some sewing, nothing like I did obviously when I was working. But, you know, I tried to do things like I had the ideas about making things and selling them, but I was too tired even to have any energy left to go into the creative side of me. Because as I heard Ram Dass say many years ago, imagine every day you get a bucket full of energy. You decide how you use it. So you can use it for sewing or you can use it for healing. Now, I think that when I started my healing process, well, I didn't only stop sewing, I stopped everything. But I did realize that the leaning towards going to sew was a kind of a denial. You know, it's when you're ill, you need rest, rest, rest. And trying to do things and carry on with a normal life, I love that word normal, is that can actually be, I'm not saying it is, but I think for me, it was a denial. You know, it was like me saying to myself, oh, like this pain is not going to stop me. I'm going to live on my life. I'm going to do this and I'm going to do that. Where in actual fact, it was slowly destroying my life. I was so tired, I could hardly live. I had to give up work. I had to sell my house because I couldn't pay my mortgage. So it took everything from me. And I'm trying to say, it's not going to change me. So yeah, that's my thoughts on my sewing and grounding.
How did it feel to give voice to your story?
Well, I have one word written down here beside me, but another word has just popped into my head when I'm asked the question now. And that word is powerful. It was so liberating and so powerful. I mean, I told my son for the first time that he had a half sister. You know, I had never, ever, ever talked about her. Her and the events of that night and that whole experience of being imprisoned was pushed down so far into my body. And my body was really suffering, really suffering. And now I had this chronic everyday headache, which meant there wasn't a moment that I didn't have a headache unless I was on medication. So yes, as I said earlier, I was able to bring her into my life. And that was a huge opening because, like I said, not only was I able to be truthful totally with some people I met, often those people told me their stories and they had similar stories to me. And it didn't surprise me really how many women had those stories because, as I said in my previous video, I think the government figures are something like 50 to 70,000 or something. But I believe there was much, much more than that. I believe there was a massive amount of women in those homes. So yeah, very liberating. If you have a kind friend who's a good listener, tell them your story. And tell them to please shut up while you talk.
So somebody asked a question about grief and dying.
Well, now, grief is a huge area and I don't have any kind of expertise in helping people. So I can only talk about my own experience. I think we usually associate grief with death and the loss that we experience when somebody in our life dies, leaves us, departs. I was 23 when my oldest brother died at 27 years of age. So that was really the first time I ever felt grief, because I think, as I told you in the last video, I had a very unusual out-of-body experience at his funeral, which really told me that I was grieving very deeply for my daughter and probably for myself too, because I think we can grieve for life experiences that we have that result in trauma or in hurt or pain of any kind. I think we can also grieve for the loss of things like relationship, particularly if a marriage breaks up. You know, there may be the loss of the dream of a home and family and all of that. I think that there can be grief at the loss of a career. And I grieved, I think, to some extent at the loss of my house, because I really love my home. And so, yes, I think that grief and the death of events or things in our life are ongoing. It's not just something that's the preserve of the person who's left behind after a death.
What gave you the ability to facilitate your own healing?
Well, first of all, if you're going to facilitate any kind of self-healing, you have to want to do it. Now, I mean in capital letters, you have to want to do it, because it's not easy. And for what that drive in me was to do it, I have to turn to my old friend astrology. Now, when I'm talking about astrology here, I'm not talking about the kind of party game, let's look at the weekly magazine and see what it says about us, because that really isn't astrology at all. Astrology is a very serious, complicated and intricate study. And interestingly enough, it's having a huge resurgence, and many, many people now are again studying astrology. Now, the natal chart, which is a chart that maps where the sun, moon, and all the planets were the moment that you were born. So having your birth time to have your natal chart is essential. And what that map shows you is how the energy is arranged and has the ability to manifest within your life. That doesn't mean that everything is mapped out for you, because you have your own free will. And I'm about to tell you some of the planetary positions that enabled me to heal. But if I had taken another route, I equally could have been a criminal. So we always have our own will to follow as is offered to us. So I go back again a little bit to Ram Dass and the bucket of energy. This is the energy you were given to live out in this lifetime. Whether you live it for good or ill is your choice. So you always have free will. Now, in my natal chart, I have my sun up in the sky, shining his light. I have that right beside the planet of Uranus. So that means that the sun, which represents my will to be in the world, to live, and the planet Uranus, that represents liberation. So those two are working together. They're in a little cozy kind of setup, having a little chat. What will we do now? What will we do next? How will we plan this out? So what was Uranus liberating me from? Well, for that, I have to look at another planet that I mentioned last podcast, Saturn. So Saturn is also in my sun sign, but at a distance from those two in their cozy bundle. Now, he's the energy of structure. And so he loves laws and structure and control. And his energy is necessary in society also. But also he's an opportunity, if you need to or want to move away from the conditioning in this current life. And so that Uranus conjunct the sun in the same sign offered me the opportunity to push against him, to liberate me from the condition and structures of my society. So you might say, well, you found a difficult way to liberate yourself. You pushed against the system and had a child outside marriage. But, that's the way the cookie crumbles, as they say. Now, they weren't alone either, because in another sign in my chart, I have the very powerful planet Pluto. Now, Pluto is the transformer. He offers us the energy to transform. Now, very often, Pluto can transform us, like he transforms society through disruption, like the position he was in when we had the banking crisis and everything, that collapse indicated that. He could also be in a position where he's indicating war. So in order to transform, there's always a death and a rebirth. And we know from our human experience that birth is only achieved through a lot of pain, howling, and blood. So the transformation can be difficult, is what I'm saying. And I think those transformations with Pluto always are. Now, on one side of him, very cozily nestled into him, is the planet Mars. And Mars is the young warrior. He has the strength to get the job done. And on the other side of Pluto is the moon. And the moon, of course, among other things, is the carrier of our emotional experiences from one life to the next. So to go back to the question of karma for a moment, that moon position shows me that if I was resolving karma, that it could have been past life, that it wasn't necessarily this life. However, with these backing up my Uranus and Sun willing to liberate me, he told me he could transform me, and I believed him. But that was the energy that I was gifted with at birth. Now, somebody has said to me that during all those years of pain and then followed on by the healing process, that I had actually cleared all my karma. I don't know if I fully understand that, so I won't go too deeply into it. I can't go too deeply into it with you. But my own sense, looking at those planetary positions through astrology, is that I did clear karma.
And next, you wanted to speak about moving forward.
Yes, I did, Cian. I think in my last podcast, I said that I hoped that I would be an inspiration to you, some of you, to start or continue a healing journey if you were on one. I just want to go back and say, like I said a few minutes ago, embarking on a healing journey in the way that I did, you have to really want to do it. You have to commit yourself fully to it. Don't dive in and start trying to meditate for 20 minutes twice a day. You're not going to be able to do it. Your mind it will be all over the place. You might be that rare human being that it isn't, but generally people's minds are all over the place. Whatever pain or discomfort you have from whatever the condition is you have in your body, if those are the kind of symptoms, it'll be difficult to withdraw from those, because one of the essentials, I'll say the two essentials to me for healing, for self-healing, is developing an ability to be still and quiet within, even for short periods of time. And the other is to be able to forgive if somebody's wronged you. And because I didn't say this when I talked about the home, what was going on at that time. But you have to remember that for me, and people did remark on the fact that I seemed like I had forgiven and that I wasn't angry, but I dealt with my anger in psychotherapy. And forgiving, remember that everybody in Irish society was in some position of difficulty and hardship at that time. It was difficult for married couples. You weren't supposed to have sex unless you produced a baby, a soul for God. So life wasn't easy for anybody, and bearing that in mind enables me to forgive. Now, by forgiveness, I don't mean that you let it go. That's not forgiving. That's just pushing it away somewhere else. for forgiveness, there is a need to be able to see the humanity of the other person or persons involved. It doesn't mean you're going to love them. I don't love anybody who was around in my life in a figure of authority at that time. You do need, however, to be able to see their humanity. And so the society that I was caught in at that time was the same society that those nuns were in. So for them, what I had done was the pure antithesis of everything they believed in. If you're starting to develop some inner stillness, start gently. Just sit whenever you think of it during the day. If you're at work, it might be your tea break, your lunch hour. Take 2 or 3 quiet breaths. I don't mean big, deep breaths, but just quiet breaths. Just focus on the breath coming in, focus on the breath coming out. The other thing I would say to you is watch what you're doing. Practice the Buddhist practice of mindfulness. So if you're chopping the vegetables for the lunch, don't be washing the floor at the same time or gone off to the afternoon and what's waiting for you in work. Try as much as you can to focus on whatever you're doing at that time. It's a practice, the same as developing inner stillness is a practice. You know, people have said to me in the past, oh, I sit down to meditate and my mind's all over the place. Of course your mind's all over the place. Your mind's like the wind. Meditation and developing inner stillness is the practice of training your mind. What did Patanjali say? Yoga is the control of the thought waves of the mind. Sometimes I sit down for a meditation in the morning and sure I don't do any because there's something so prominent in my mind. I might do a few seconds here and there and then I'm back to whatever it is that's demanding my attention. Other times I can have a beautiful meditation. So don't be disheartened. Now, there are some things that can help, and many of you may know of these already. My own personal favourite is the 5 rhythms. Then there's yoga. Then there's Buddhist practices, things like Tai Chi. There's also reading material that brings you solace. For instance, I have read the Psalms from time to time in the Bible rather than the stories of the Bible themselves. I find those can bring me a lot of solace. Or reading the verses of the Tao, and maybe accompanied by an explanation or an exercise to do with them. Things like that can help us to focus within. Developing a healthy lifestyle of eating well and exercising and just the way you go about living your life can really help. I saw a beautiful quote from Jack Cornfield, that famous Buddhist, during the week, and I thought I'd love to share it with you because I thought it was really appropriate to what I was talking about in my first interview, or my first podcast, sorry, little slip of the tongue there. He said, bringing your attention to pain as if you were comforting a small child. Isn't that beautiful? Holding it with a loving and soothing attention. That is the most helpful thing I've read all week. Whatever you do, I would say to you, go gently, mind your precious self, and remember you are safe, secure, and loved. Thank you, and God bless you.